Indian political thought: The Truths and Lies of Nationalism, as narrated by Charvak, edited and with annotations by Partha Chatterjee. Chapter 1: All Nations Are Modern. There are no ancient nations anywhere in the world. All nations, Rashtra, are modern. Ancient Greece, ancient Egypt, ancient China, ancient India, all of them may have had great civilizations whose architecture, art, and literature are objects of admiration. But they were not nations. To realize this truth, you will have to forget for the time being the history you were taught at school. Because it is that history, drilled into your heads from the time you were children and constantly renewed by national festivals and ceremonies, the speeches of your leaders and novels, films, and television serials that make it seem obvious to you that your nation is ancient. But I will show you that this is merely a conventional idea, a samskar. You take it for granted because everyone says it is so. In actual fact, it is not true. Your nation is not, indeed, no nation on earth is ancient. Only modern people can imagine it that way. The modern Hindi word for nation, Rashtra, makes this clear. The word Rashtra merges the idea of the nation with that of the state, Rajya. The nation is, as it were, represented by the state, just as the state stands for the nation. In effect, the Hindi word Rashtra is today equivalent to the English term nation state. If we take this meaning of the nation, then it is obvious that the Indian Rashtra as a nation state has only been in existence since the middle of the 20th century. If we want to push that history a little further back by claiming that the Indian National Congress as an organized political body was the Indian Rashtra in waiting, even that would not take you beyond the last decades of the 19th century. The Indian nation would still be a very modern entity. The Indian nation would still be a very modern entity. But you may ask, what about the great kingdoms and empires of the past? The empires of the Mauryas, the Guptas, the Delhi Sultanate, Vijayanagar, the Mughals, the Marathas, were they not great states? They certainly were, but they were empires, not nations. The various parts of those states were held together by military force and tribute paying arrangements. That is not how the parts of a nation state are supposed to be bound together. Even the Marathas held territories outside the Maharashtra region by the regular use of armed force and extraction of tribute from local rulers and populations who were looked upon as subjected peoples. The Marathas too had an empire, not a nation. If you think about it carefully, the connection between nation and state, indicated by the word Rashtra, is established by a third term. That term is the people, lok. When you talk about the nation, you do not immediately think of natural resources or ancient ruins or the Himalayas or the Vedas. You think of the people of India. Therein lies the crucial difference between the ancient kingdoms and the modern nation state. Ashoka or Akbar may have been great rulers. Their subjects may even have been relatively happy and prosperous. Let us grant that for argument's sake. But the empire of Ashoka or Akbar was not based on the sovereignty of the people. No one in those times could even think of such a concept. The people were subjects of the emperor whom they regarded as the sovereign. I'm sure you know that popular sovereignty is a modern idea which emerged in Western Europe and North America in the late 18th century, spread to South America and other parts of Europe in the 19th, and then came to the countries of Asia and Africa in the 20th. The revolutionaries in France, claiming to speak on behalf of the nation, demanded in 1789 that the people and not the king and his nobles must rule. They cut off the king's head. In North and later South America, The European settlers of the British and Spanish colonies declared themselves as nations, rebelled against the British and Spanish empires, and proclaimed republics of the people. In Central and Eastern Europe, all through the 19th century, various peoples declared themselves as nations and demanded their own states. Without the claim to popular sovereignty, there can be no nation state or Rashtra. Therefore, all nations are modern. At this point, if your mind is agile and you are following the discussion carefully, you may come back with a counter argument. Fair enough, you might say. Let us grant that the nation as state is a modern phenomenon. The awareness of popular sovereignty and self determination may also be something that has spread across the world only in recent times. But what about the people themselves? Can the people not be ancient? Could they not have memories and traditions that are thousands of years old? Could not the ancientness of culture give a people its identity? I have to concede that this is a serious argument that demands a careful response. So you will have to be patient with me. An ancient people. Imagine yourself at Sarnath. You have probably visited the place before. What will you see there? You will see an impressive structure which you may recognize as a Buddhist stupa. You will see a sandstone pillar which you will be told was ordered to be built by the Emperor Ashoka in the 3rd century before the Common Era. There are inscriptions on the pillar which you will not be able to read unless you happen to be a specialist. The language is an Eastern Prakrit which, if read out to you, may sound vaguely familiar. But the script is Brahmi, which is no longer in use anywhere. In the museum, you will immediately recognize the lion capital of Ashoka, made thoroughly familiar by its reproduction on banknotes and government stationery. You will see the ruins of a Buddhist vihara, which, the tourist guide may tell you, was where more than 1,000 monks and scholars lived when the Chinese traveler Xuanzang visited the place in the 7th century. The entire place is now an archaeological monument. No one lives there, and the only people you will see are tourists and pilgrims. The guidebook will tell you that the place became famous because that is where Gautam Buddha first preached his Dhamma. Many of the things you see will seem quite familiar to you, and even if you were visiting the place for the first time, you will feel an exciting sensation of recognition. But stop for a moment and ask yourself, who were the people who lived here when the place was inhabited and functional? What did they wear? What language did they speak? What did they eat? Since we know that this was a Buddhist monastery and place of pilgrimage, we could make the conditional inference, Anuman, that the people who lived here were Buddhist monks and scholars. Therefore, they are likely to have read, written, and spoken Pali. Some of them may even have been fluent in Sanskrit. Since we know that monks and scholars came to Sarnath from many places in India and elsewhere, they must have also brought with them their native languages, which not everyone would have understood. What about the people who lived in the neighboring villages, the farmers and artisans and traders? What language did they speak? Well, they certainly did not speak Hindi as everyone in the area does now, because the Hindi language did not exist then. They probably spoke some variety of what the Brahmins call Prakrit, assigning it the lowly status of a coarse dialect carrying the pungent smell of virgin soil and wild forests as distinct from their own supremely redefined Dev Bhasha, the language presumably spoken by the gods, assigning it the lowly status of a coarse dialect carrying the pungent smell of virgin soil and wild forests as distinct from their own supremely refined Dev Bhasha, the language presumably spoken by the gods. Anyway, whatever variety of Prakrit these people may have spoken, I can assure you that you would not have understood any of it. What did they wear? What did they eat? Modern historians have scoured through religious and literary texts and examined inscriptions and archaeological artifacts to come up with some answers. These are conditional inferences that you will find in history books. They are all valuable information. I am by no means denying that. But what makes you believe that those people living in and around Sarnath 1500 years ago were your people? What is it that ties you and others of your kind, let us call them modern Indians, to those people in the ancient past? Let me give you another set of examples. Make one more imaginative journey and take yourself to the pyramids of Egypt or, if you prefer, the Parthenon in Greece. I have never been to those places but have seen pictures. Once again, you will be faced with impressive structures that come from ancient times. Of course, you know they are ancient only because archaeologists and historians have told you so. How else could a non expert tell simply by looking at the stones how old they are? But you know the pyramids, including the gigantic Sphinx at the edge of the desert in Giza and Parthenon on top of the hill in Athens, are ancient monuments that have become famous icons of ancient Egyptian and Greek civilizations. They will be both familiar and unfamiliar to you, in the same way that Sarnath was, because you will know something about the people who lived there in ancient times, and may find out more about them by going to the library or searching the internet. There will also be much that you will not know. But would you ever feel that the people of ancient Egypt or Greece were your people? Never. So here is my question to you. What is it that makes you imagine the people of ancient Sarnath as your people but not those of ancient Egypt or Athens? The answer is obvious. You will tell me the remains of Sarnath are in the territorial region we call India. Those of ancient Egypt or Greece are somewhere else, far away. It is geography that binds together the people of India today with those of ancient India. To clarify your answer, let me ask you to do one more imaginative experiment. I promise this will be the last time I will ask you to do this. Imagine yourself walking through the ruins of Mohenjo-daro, the famous ancient city of the Indus Valley or Harappan civilization. I did visit the place once some years ago, with its brick houses arranged in straight lines and rectangular blocks, a central marketplace, public buildings, baths, and covered drains. The planned city seems to have been built by a people with a sophisticated culture. There are debates among scholars about how those people were. We will come to that subject presently, but everyone is agreed that these ruins, representing the urban phase of the Indus civilization, are from a period between 2600 BCE and 1900 BCE. They are also the earliest examples that have been found so far of an ancient high culture in the Indian subcontinent. But remember, Mohenjo-daro is now located in Sindh province in Pakistan. If you are an Indian citizen, you will probably have some difficulty getting there. Does that pose a problem for modern Indians to claim its history as their own? Could you say, in the same way that you did in the case of Sarnath, that the people who lived in Mohenjo-daro 4 or 5,000 years ago were your people? I know that is an easy question to answer. You will smile and say, we have already decided that the nation state is a modern creation, but a people may be ancient. So, why should the present boundaries of the nation states of Pakistan and India prevent Indians from claiming the Indus civilization as their own? It is a good answer. But just to be aware of the implications, let me point out that history textbooks in Pakistan also begin with the story of the Harappan civilization and claim the ancient people of the Indus Valley as their people. They continue the story into the Vedic period and the rise of Buddhism, in which Punjab and the northwestern region of Pakistan played a very important part. The ancient city of Takshila being the major center from where the Buddhist faith traveled to Central Asia and China. That history is not inconsistent with your answer. The people of the modern nation state of Pakistan claim as their own, for reasons of geography, the ancient tradition associated with the lower and upper Indus Valley civilizations, as well as Takshila, even though they date the beginning of the Pakistani nation from the Arab conquest of parts of Sindh in the year 711. But it means that the same ancient history and tradition may be claimed by different peoples. It may not be the exclusive property of one nation. Ancient history is like an inheritance shared by many. But your nationalist leaders will not be satisfied with that answer. An ancient Hindu nation. Let us now come to the big debate over the people of the Indus Valley civilization. Who were they? This much is known with a high level of certainty. At least that is what I have gathered from scholars. The existence of a civilization of such antiquity was unknown to the modern world until the Mound of the Dead in Sindh was excavated by Rakhal Das Banerjee in the early 1920s. Connecting Banerjee's discovery of a set of seals in Mohenjo-daro with similar seals found a few years before by Dayaram Sahni in Harappa in Punjab, John Marshall of the Archaeological Survey of India announced to the world in 1924 that a hitherto unknown ancient civilization had been discovered in the Indus Valley. Since then, a large number of such Indus or Harappan sites have been found in a region straddling Balochistan, Sindh, Gujarat, Rajasthan, Punjab, and Haryana, indicating a Bronze Age people who practiced agriculture, made pottery and metal objects, had urban settlements and seaports, and engaged in long distance trade over land and sea. No one can tell what their language was, since the inscriptions on the Harappa seals have not been deciphered. There is also clear evidence that the various Harappa urban settlements were abundant from around 2000 BCE. Why? The answers have become controversial. British archaeologists who worked at the sites argued that since linguistic evidence from the Rig Veda and the ancient Persian Avesta indicated that the Vedic civilization of the Sanskrit speaking Indo Aryans could not have been earlier than 1200 to 1500 BCE, the Indus Valley people were a distinct pre Aryan race, Jati, very likely Dravidians. In 1946, Mortimer Wheeler, looking at the positions where certain skeletons had been found on the Mohenjo-daro site, made the dramatic announcement that the ancient Indus cities had been subjected to a sudden and massive invasion by hordes of Aryan soldiers on horseback. Wheeler's theory is not taken seriously by scholars anymore. The more common explanation for the emptying of the towns is some environmental calamity such as huge and repeated floods, or more likely, a prolonged drought or an economic collapse such as the decline of trade. Most scholars today believe that the Harappan civilization was in sharp decline well before the emergence of the Vedic people whose territories, though overlapping to some extent with the Harappan, was situated more to the north in Haryana, Punjab, the northwest frontier province, now Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, and eastern Afghanistan. In this view, the Indo-Aryans, whose language, Sanskrit, is part of the Indo-European family of languages, migrated from Central Asia to the northwestern parts of the Indian subcontinent over a spell of time after 1500 BCE. Given the theories of race that were still strong in European anthropology and historical linguistics in the early 20th century, the question of the relation between the Indus and the Vedic peoples became entangled with racial distinctions. Thus, the people calling themselves Arya were described as fair skinned outsiders who subjugated the dark skinned Dravidians, whom they called Anarya. The Vedic Varna classification came into use here because it could be interpreted to suggest that the four caste hierarchy of Brahman, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and Shudra reflected variations in skin color, the darker indigenous people being partially absorbed into the Varna order at its lowest rungs. This overlooks the fact that the caste (jati) order was extremely rudimentary in the early Rig Veda period and did not acquire any of the characteristics of the jati formations we know today. The explanations offered by these early British archaeologists were in fact based on extremely crude theories of race that have been discredited. But the Aryan Dravidian racial distinction still casts a shadow on popular debates today. Scholars holding the view that the Vedic peoples were immigrants who came after the decline of the Harappa cities point to the following pieces of evidence. Linguistic analysis suggests that the Rig Veda hymns were not much older than the Gatha of the ancient Persian Avesta, which are dated at around 700 BCE. Hence, the Vedic peoples were certainly later than the peoples of the Indus-Harappa civilization. Further, Vedic Sanskrit adopted many loanwords from the Vedic languages to refer to various material objects of common use. It also adopted the retroflex or murdhanya consonants, namely the hard t, dh, d, dh, n, common to most Indian languages but absent in other Indo-European languages. The retroflex appears to have entered Sanskrit from Dravidian or Mundari languages spoken in India. Then there is the continued existence of stray Dravidian language speakers in northern India, such as the Brahui speakers of Balochistan, the Kurukh of Nepal, and the Uraon and Gond of central India. Finally, textual evidence suggests beyond any doubt that the Vedic peoples were adept in the use of horses and chariots with spoked wheels. To this day, there is no clear evidence that the Indus-Harappa people used horses. Recent scholars have been led by this evidence to conclude that, contrary to the old Aryan invasion story, the Aryan peoples migrated from Central Asia to northern India and, rather than driving the Dravidians to the south, largely mingled with the indigenous population, gradually absorbing them into a new social order marked by hierarchies and discrimination, assimilation as well as exclusion, cohesion as well as conflict. But the idea of the Vedic Aryans as immigrants unsettles the deep nationalist desire to claim an ancient past for the Indian people. The heritage of an ancient civilization whose record is preserved in the large Sanskrit literary canon and whose achievements rival those of classical Greece, as certified by leading European Orientalists, is held with enormous pride by modern Indians. That pride is severely dented if it has to be admitted that the Vedic Aryans were not the original inhabitants of this country and instead came from somewhere in Central Asia. Not only that, It is another blow to nationalist pride if it is claimed that there was in fact an earlier great civilization in the Indus Valley bearing no relation to the Vedic people, one whose language and culture are unknown and whose subsequent fate remains to be investigated. Nationalist ideology is impatient with such cautious judgments. So the rival claim has been made that the inhabitants of the ancient Harappan and Vedic civilizations were in fact the same people, indigenous to India. While the former lived mainly in the valleys of the river Indus, the latter were settled along the lost river Saraswati, part of whose course has been identified as the Ghaggar in eastern Punjab. The language of the Indus people was Proto-Indo-European, that is to say, an earlier form of Sanskrit. Besides, even though there is very little material evidence of horses in the Indus civilization, that absence does not by itself rule out the possibility that horses were in use. The proponents of the rival view therefore insist that instead of the Vedic Aryans having to come to India from Central Asia, the migration had occurred in the other direction. Aryans first developed an indigenous civilization in India, the Indus Saraswati civilization, which then spread through the migration of the Aryan peoples to Iran, Central Asia, and Europe. In fulfilling its desire to establish the thoroughly native provenance of the ancient high civilizations of India, the rival theory runs into several difficulties. First, if the Indo-Aryans were the progenitors of the later peoples of Iran and Europe, then Sanskrit would have to be the mother of the Indo-European languages, which is definitely not the case. Second, how does one count for the presence of Dravidian languages in North India, or the fact that Sanskrit has retroflex consonants which are completely absent in other Indo-European languages? Surely, if Sanskrit was their mother, the languages of ancient Iran or Europe should have had Dravidian elements. Third, the argument stemming from the absence of evidence of horses in the Indus sites, while it could inject a useful dose of skepticism into overly confident assertions that the Harappan civilization was radically different from the Indo-Aryan, does not constitute a positive claim about the presence of horses. But then, this is a classic case where the conclusion to be proved has been decided before the study is conducted or the evidence gathered. As a result, the evidence is made to suit the conclusion. The a priori object, Purvanunman, here was to prove that the Vedic Aryans, the acknowledged progenitors of the Hindus, were native to India and were the same people who created the ancient Indus civilization. The evidence had to be picked to prove this case. Discovering the historical truth was not the main object of this exercise.
I should also point out the assumptions you are making when your heart swells with pride at the thought that your ancient ancestors had composed the great verses in praise of the Vedic gods. Even though I suspect Vedic Sanskrit will sound as strange to you as ancient Mongolian, the Vedic literature, whether in verse or, as in the case of Yajurveda, prose, is essentially liturgical. That is to say, it deals with performance of the sacrifice or yajna. The only people involved in the Vedic sacrifice were kings, warriors, and ritual specialists, Purohit Brahman. In other words, the religion culture around the Vedic yajna was confined to the elites of society. The vast masses of the people who lived in the northwestern regions of Indian subcontinent 3000 years ago were excluded from that culture. Indeed, women, the lower orders, and Anaira people were prohibited from even hearing the Vedas being recited or sung. Further, the Vedas are full of stories of the Dev, that is, gods, led by Indra, fighting the Asur. The gods usually won, but only by the skin of their teeth, because the Asur were also powerful beings. Who were they? In the early Vedas, they are divine creatures who refused to accept the Vedic gods. But in the later Brahman and Samhita literature, they become identical with local enemy chiefs who are referred to with contempt as Dasyu and Dasa, that is, bandits and slaves. It is interesting, however, that several later ruling dynasties all over India have in their mythical genealogies an ancestor with the name Asur. This indicates that people who were earlier opposed to Vedic Arya later became incorporated into the political and social order while retaining a memory of their antecedents in their mythical history. Besides, the term Asur, when applied to non Arya people or their leaders, seemed to indicate an acknowledgement on the part of Vedic elites that an enemy had special magical powers. It has been speculated that this had to do with the fact that many indigenous people had knowledge of material processes such as extraction and use of iron and healing methods that the Vedic people did not have. Did you know that there still exists a so called tribe in the present Jharkhand region that is called Asur, whose traditional livelihood over century was iron smelting? If you care for facts, you would have to admit that Arya in ancient India came to mean not just a race, jati, but an elite group of high status who could perform the Vedic rituals by reciting the proper Sanskrit mantras. Indeed, even among those who called themselves Arya, there were few from whom Sanskrit was the mother tongue. They spoke some other language and learned Sanskrit as a language of distinction. Others in northern India, who were described as Prakritajan, spoke one or the other Prakrit language belonging to the Dravidian or Mundari family, but accepted borrowed words from Sanskrit to produce, after centuries, the early forms of the modern Indian languages as we know them. I have heard some teachers in your universities claim that because Sanskrit literature has many instances of scholars from across the length and breadth of Bharatvarsha recognizing each other as part of the same learned community, the idea of India as a nation has existed for centuries. I used to know many of these old pundits of yesteryears. Let me assure you that even if they recognize themselves as belonging to a Samaj, spread across the land from the Himalayas to the seas, that community certainly did not include carpenters and cobblers and blacksmiths, nor could the Pandits have even remotely imagined the Kol or Bhil or Munda as part of any idea of India. When I listen to these debates, I wonder how your professors can waste their valuable learnings in such thoroughly meaningless debates. The point is that when you identify the ancientness of the Indian people with the Arya or of the Vedas, regardless of whether you want to push it further back to an Indus Saraswati civilization, you are in fact choosing the ancient tradition of only a very small section. There are many other groups of modern Indians with completely different traditions. Parampara, the Tamil literary tradition, for instance, is ancient, going back to at least 450 BCE, and to this day it remains the least influenced by Sanskrit loanwords. The Sangram literature was produced between 300 BCE and 300 CE, and a first century text such as the Thikkurular can be read by Tamil schoolchild today without any difficulty. Can you imagine an average student in Haryana school reading the Rig Veda? If the Tamil had to think of themselves as an ancient people, why would they look to the Indus Saraswati civilization? Let me also remind you of another curious but also very important fact. Several different terms are used in many Indian languages to refer to the modern meanings of nation, state, and people. In India, as you know, the standard terms are Rashtra, Rajya, and Lok or Janta. Each of these words have a history in Sanskrit which connected them to political and social units in the past of varying sizes, from a group of villagers or a town, Janpad, to a kingdom, Rajya, to an empire, Samrajya. But they certainly did not mean what they mean today. The current meanings in Hindi came to be fixed in the 20th century. There is nothing strange about this, because if you look at Europe, even though the words state, nation, and people come from Latin, they did not earlier mean what they now mean in the European languages. Other Indian languages picked other words, some from Sanskrit, some from other languages. Thus, in Bengali, the standard word used to mean nation is jati, which also means caste. The word for state is rashtra, which is completely different from its use in Hindi. The word for people is jan, gun, or lok. In Odia and Assamese, the most common term for nation is des. In Telugu too, nation is desam. Remember the Telugu Desam party? While in Tamil, it is the same word in its Tamil form, tekam. The state is Rajya in Kannada and Malayalam, but Rashtram in Telugu. Tamil uses very different words to mean the state, Arasu or Manilam. I could go on with other examples from other Indian languages. All that they would show is that words borrowed from Sanskrit acquired completely modern and often different meanings in the Indian languages in the 20th century to express political ideas that did not exist in the past. I have talked so far of the major modern Indian languages. The so called tribal peoples of central India, the Santal, Kol, Bhil, Oran, Munda, etc., all have oral mythical traditions, parampara, whose historical provenance is hard to determine but are doubtless ancient. They speak languages that do not belong to the Indo-Aryan family but to the Austroasiatic and Dravidian families. If you take the oral tradition of Santals, for instance, it is a long story of migration from one place to another. The names are impossible to locate on map, caused by repeated attacks by well-armed enemies, until they managed to settle for a long spell of time in a country called Champa, where each lineage, such as Hambrom, Kisku, Murmu, Tudu, etc., built their own forts to defend themselves. But once more they were pronounced upon the Diku, outsiders who forced them to move to the forests of the Santal Parganas. The Santal lore suggests that every time they cleared forests and settled down to a sedentary life, the agriculture and commercial society of the Diku, that is, the society organized within the Brahmical caste order, set their sights on acquiring that land. It is true of it is true of course that in the course of centuries of economic and political interaction, the so called tribal communities of central India have accepted some more than others many features of Puranic traditions. But even as they adopted various Puranic gods, they continued to maintain in their oral traditions an antagonistic relation with the Brahmical religious order, and they certainly have nothing to do with Vedic traditions. And before you dismiss these tribal origin myths as merely oral traditions, let me remind you that the Vedas too were originally an oral, not written tradition. I have to push to the point even further. If you remember the present boundaries of Indian nation state, how would you expect the Sikkimese, Khasi, Mizo, Naga, and Meitei people to identify with the ancient achievements of Vedic era? Their origin myths, linguistic traits, and cultural practices suggest migrations from Tibet, Southeast China, Burma, Thailand, Indonesia, and perhaps even Oceania. If you are to continue to insist on the ancientness of Indian people going back to the Vedic civilization, you will have to exclude all these people from the hallowed ranks of Indians. And at this point, I am not even raising the question of the explicitly anti Vedic religions such as Jainism and Buddhism and their social foundations in caste, economic, and cultural conflicts, nor indeed am I opening the contentious question of Islamic tradition in India. The evidence from genetic science. On the question of the early inhabitants of India, there is a new body of evidence that is now emerging. I have no training in these sciences myself, but I try to keep myself informed through conversations with specialists. If you believe in science, you should take this evidence seriously. Genetic scientists have developed methods for analyzing DNA samples extracted from human skeletons found within archaeological sites. The analysis of Y chromosomes, mitochondrial DNA, and whole genome sequences from a growing number of genetic samples collected from several sites in India and Pakistan are yielding dramatic accounts of the early demographic history of this country. Let me tell you some of these stories. You have probably heard that genetic scientists are now confident that the lineages of all humans everywhere in the world can be traced back on the common sense of ancestors in Africa. You must realize the significance of this scientific finding before jumping to conclusions about these first modern humans who were different from the archaic species of humans such as Homo erectus, Neanderthals, and Denisovans. We do not know how these earliest modern humans looked, but the fact that their descendants now include Scandinavians, Japanese, Bolivians, Nigerians, Arabs, and even other people on earth makes it certain that the way we look today is the result of centuries of genetic mutation caused by migration as well as regional and local patterns of intermingling among peoples. The fact of common origin does not mean that there are no genetic differences between different human groups. but it does demolish claims to racial purity or inhabiting a country from time immemorial. All humans are, at some point or other in their ancestry, the children of migrants. The earliest modern humans migrated about 70,000 years ago from Africa to Asia, most likely from present day Eritrea across the Red Sea into present day Yemen. Some of these migrants they moved further in India and found the central and southern parts of the country inhabited by archaic humans such as Neanderthals. One wave of migrants from Africa took a route below the foothills of Himalayas and the other along two coastline to ultimately cross into Southeast Asia, East Asia, and Australia. These migrants from Africa were in fact the first Indians. Sometime between 45,000 and 20,000 years ago, the first Indians discovered the use of microlithic tools. This led to a rapid increase in their population and the extension of other more archaic species of humans. We know very little of Stone Age human societies in India because so few prehistoric sites have been excavated. Our interest seems to have been fixated on providing the ancientness of historical civilizations. But I will soon tell you why the prehistoric first Indians are so important for India's demographic history. The first signs of agriculture in South Asia are to be found from 7000 BCE at a site in 7000 BCE at a site called Mehergarh in Balochistan. From this time for the next 3 or 4000 years, there is an influx into the region of Iranian agriculturists who mix with the first Indians. These are the people who between 5500 and 1900 BCE created the Harappan civilization, which archaeologists now divide into the early and mature periods. The cultivation of barley and wheat had to be then spread all across northwestern India, and beginnings of rice cultivation can also be observed. The mature Harappa period shows, as I have told you earlier, evidence of a developed urban society. The late Harappa period, between 1900 and 1300 BCE, saw the decline and disappearance of the civilization. The people we call Aryans were pastoralists, not agriculturists, or urban, who migrated between 2000 and 1000 BCE from the steppe region of Kazakhstan to present-day Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan, and then southwards into Afghanistan, northwestern Pakistan, and northern India. These migrations brought the Indo-European languages and sacrificial religious practices into South Asia. Around the same time, there was another wave of migration originating in China and moving through Southeast Asia into Eastern India. This brought the Austroasiatic languages and new varieties of rice cultivation into India. That, in a nutshell, is the demographic history of this country as constructed from genetic evidence. You may remember a news item about a young American missionary called John Allen Chow, who in November 2018 went to North Sentinel Island in the Andamans to preach Christianity to the reclusive hunting-gathering people living there. Sadly, he was killed and his body left on the beach. The Sentinels are supposed to be among the world's last peoples to resist contact with outsiders. This might lead you to think that they must be the oldest surviving human community in India, but that is not necessarily the case. We know nearly nothing about when and from where they come, or whether their isolation is from ancient times or recent. What we do know from genetic evidence is that another indigenous people of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, the Ongi, from whom there are only about 100 alive today, and who lived for a long time in relative isolation, are descendants of the first Indians who migrated from Africa. But before you draw any conclusion about the primitiveness of the Ongi, let me tell you how much more remarkable fact that emerges from the study of whole genome sequences. Some 650 to 65% of all Indians have an ancestry going back to the first Indians. So the Ongi are not exceptional at all. If you like to think racially, they belong to the same race, Jati, as most Indians. If you look at ancestry by mitochondrial DNA lineage, that is through maternal line, the evidence is even stronger. Between 70 and 90% of the people of this country are descendant from the first Indians. However, if you take the Y chromosome lineage, descent through the main line only, then only 10 to 40% come from first Indians. Because the genetic record of our mixture with later migrants is to be found in the patrilineal descent. The reason should be obvious. Successive waves of male migrants coming from elsewhere united with indigenous females to produce the mixed progeny we now call Indians. I am reminded of the sociologist Binoy Kumar Sarkar, a learned and much travelled man whom I used to know. He taught in economics department of the University of Calcutta in 1930s. He would come into class and ask all the Brahmin students to stand up. Needless to say, in those days that was a large part of the class. He would then hold up a book with the photograph of Santal woman and ask, "Do you recognize her? That is your great grandmother. Go home and tell your parents that I showed you a picture of your great grandmother." Professor Sarkar was being provocative, but even though he did not know of genome sequences, he was right in his intuition that the female line of descent of most Indian todays, regardless of caste, goes back to the Adivasi women who carried the longest lineage, Kul, that is most widely shared across the country. The pastoralists from the steppes of Central Asia moved westwards into Europe around 3000 BCE and southwards into India around 2000 BCE. These are the people familiarly known as the Aryans, though scientists prefer to call them steppe pastoralists. The interesting difference in the two migrations is that the steppe pastoralists almost completely replaced the earlier inhabitants of Europe, whereas in India, the first Indians, in their mixed form of the Harappa people, survived the migration and settlement of the steppe pastoralists. The genetic trace of earlier hunter-gatherer population can be found today among less than 10% of Europeans, whereas the majority of Indians have whole genome sequences that belonged to the first Indians. If you take the evidence of languages, 95% of people in Western Europe speak an Indo-European language, whereas only 75% of Indians do so. Some 20% speak a Dravidian language, so perhaps I might provoke you by suggesting that Europeans are much more Aryan than Indians. The genetic evidence makes it clear that almost all Indians have a mixture of First Indian, Harappan, and Steppe pastoralist ancestries, but in different proportions. These differences actually suggest that after a period of considerable mixing, population groups in India begin to mix less and less from around 100 CE, indicating the emergence of the endogamous caste jati structures we all know well. How tight these endogamous groups actually were, how rigidly the prohibition on marrying across castes was observed, and how these caste formations varied across region are questions to which genetic research is sure to provide useful answers in the days to come. It may also tell us much more of the fragmentation of castes and the emergence of new caste groups of which historians and anthropologists have spoken at such length. What is certain is that you can no longer claim any scientific evidence for believing in the Aryans as the original inhabitants of India or the Vedic civilization as the ultimate source of Indian culture. All I have shown you so far is that the attempt to trace the ancient past of the people who constitute the modern Indian nation to the Arya people of the Vedas is based far more on imaginative fiction than historical or scientific fact. But as I have told you before, your national leaders are not the only ones to perform this feat. They have learnt it from European nationalists. How is it that from the 18th century, European scholars who were mostly Christian began to imagine the pagan people of ancient Greece and Rome as their cultural ancestors? Most of these scholars looked upon their contemporary Greeks and Italians as dirty, idle, and vulgar, hardly deserving the status of Europeans. That is to say, while claiming the civilization inheritance of classical Greece and Rome for themselves, the pundits of Western Europe denied that gift to modern Greeks and Italians. Now think about this. How could the modern Scot or Norwegian imagine the people of ancient Athens as their people? The desire to have an ancient nation can produce wonderful acts of imaginative fiction. I will tell you later how the work of imagination actually takes place. It is a fascinating story.
So the title is Statement in Ancient India by Dr. A.S. Alchikar. Let's start from chapter 2, Origin and Types of the State, page number 12. Modern works on polity devote considerable space to the discussion of the question of the origin of state. No contemporary evidence is available, ever likely to be available to enlighten us on the point, while we possess ample evidence to show how some particular states originated among people already accustomed to political life. We have only the uncertain light of legends and mythology to visualize the circumstances under which men for the first time associated themselves into a political organization. We are, therefore, left more or less to speculate on the problem. The modern speculation, however, is largely influenced by the scientific method and the theory on evolution and seeks to fortify its conclusion by such analogies as can be drawn from the known condition of societies which are more or less in an uncivilized condition at the present time. We should not forget that this line of approach was unknown to the ancients, whether of the East or of the West. Most institutions were regarded in ancient India as due to divine agency or inspiration, and the state was no exception to this rule. We have occasional speculations on the origin of the state in the Mahabharata and the Dighanikaya, and through these works belong to different centuries and religions, their versions shows a marked similarity. They both aver that for a long time after the creation of society, there prevailed a golden age of harmony and happiness, when people led virtuous and peaceful lives on account of their innate virtuous disposition. Through there existed no government to see that the laws of nature were respected and followed. Popular imagination has dreamt of a golden age in the dim and distant past, not only in the East but also in the West. Plato's Republic may well be regarded as the idealization of such a golden age. The actual state could be only a faint copy of the ideal one delineated by him. As late as the 18th century, Rousseau held that the era of golden age had disappeared many centuries ago. The utmost that men could do, now moving to page number 13, today was to try to realize it to some extent in the present imperfect society. The Mahabharata goes on to narrate that society flourished without a king or law court for a long time, but later somehow there was a normal degeneration. People fell from rectitude, greed, selfishness, and cupidity began to sway their mind, and the earthly paradise, which they had been enjoying, was soon converted into a veritable hell. The law of the jungle began to prevail. The strong devoured the weak, as is the order of the day among the fish, Matsya Nyaya. Gods then became alarmed and decided to remedy the situation. When men went out in a deputation to pray for relief, Brahmadev, the chief god, thought over the matter and came to the conclusion that human society can survive only if a code of law was framed and enforced through the instrumentality of a king. He composed a comprehensive code, created an asexual son named Virajas, appointed him king, and men agreed to obey his orders. This account of the Mahabharata shows that state was regarded as a divine institution. King's right to govern was partially due to his divine creation and partially due to the agreement of the subjects to be governed by him, in order that anarchy may come to an end. We may passingly note that the theory of the divine origin of state was widely held in Europe under the influence of the Christian dogma, especially in the Middle Ages when the king was regarded as the anointed representative of God, ruling by divine right. Islam also shared a similar view, for it regarded king as the shadow of God. The version of the Dighanikaya resembles the above account to a great extent. Buddhists did not believe in God. Moving to page number 14. And so, Brahmadeva, as the creator of the first king and code, does naturally not figure in it. But we are told that in the dim and the distant past, there was a golden age when men who had ethereal and refugian bodies lived in virtue and happiness. Somehow there was a fall from this ideal state. There arose anarchy and chaos, and people wondered how to put an end to it. Eventually, there arose on the scene a person named Mahajan Samata, literally one acceptable to the great community, who was born asexually. He was wise, virtuous, and able, and the public requested him to become their king and to put an end to the prevailing chaos. He acceded to their request, and people then elected him to be their king, agreeing to give him a part of their paddy in return for his services. The belief of the Hindus and the Buddhists that there was a golden age preceding the evolution of government clearly shows that they held that society came into existence earlier than government. This is the correct view. language is first evolved and then grammar is based upon it. Narda and Brihaspati also refer to the Golden Age and the state of war which succeeded it, but they do not offer any useful observations on the origin of state. A survey of the above passages shows that whatever may be the state of affairs in the mythical past, Hindu thinkers held that state was an indispensable institution for the orderly existence and progress of society in the world, as known to us in historic times. A country without government cannot even exist. They regarded state as a divine institution, implying thereby that it is an old as society and owed its origin to the social and political instinct which is twin born with men. The Mahabharata implies that people accepted Virajas as their king. The Dighanikaya expressly states that Mahajan Samata accepted the people's request to put an end to anarchy and thereupon people elected him to be their king. There is no doubt a notion here of government coming into existence as a result of some implied contract. Some such ideas seem to have been also in the mind of Dharmasutra writers when they aver that the king is a servant of the people. Moving to page number 15, with the duty of protection, 16% tax being his wage. Hindu writers, however, do not further develop the idea of contract, probably because they had realized that it could not be fully applicable to the origin of government and society. These come into existence out of conditions primarily arising from the sociability inherent in human nature. It is now generally recognized that the contract theory of the origin of government is bad history and worse logic. It can no doubt explain the origin of a particular form of state among people who have already developed governmental institutions, but it cannot explain how the first agreement took place among the members of a community, which was still in a state of nature. Contract is possible only in a society where mutual rights and obligations are respected, and this is obviously impossible in a society where the law of the jungle prevails. It would be, however, interesting to compare ancient Indian theory of contract with similar theories advanced in the West. The theory is rarely referred to by ancient thinkers of Greece and Rome. It is worked out in detail only in the post Reformation period. Hobbes and Locke are its important advocates. Like most of the ancient Indian thinkers, Hobbes held that there was a state of anarchy in the beginning, the hand of each being against all. Tired of the state, people eventually agreed to surrender part of their rights to the sovereign. It was not, however, a contract between the sovereign on one side and the people on the other. It was merely an agreement among the people, which imposed no obligations upon the sovereign, who, however, got unlimited and irrevocable rights under it. Hindu writers also, like Hobbes, have presupposed a contract which eventually put an end to the law of the jungle. But it was not a contract which imposed obligations only on the people. The first king got no unlimited rights under it. His powers were restricted by the code of law prepared by Brahmadeva for him, if not by the terms of the contract. According to Locke, the state of nature in the pre government period was more or less analogous to the golden age of the Hindu mythology. People, as a general rule, obeyed the laws of reason and nature and respected one another's person. Switching to page number 16, and property. When, however, occasional breaches of law occurred, each individual could act both as a judge and executor of his own decrees, which created certain inconveniences. Through the law of nature was known to all, Still, owing to a difference of intelligence and conflicts of interest, disputes arose as to the method of its enforcement, which gave rise to confusion and uncertainty in life. To put an end to it, people entered into a covenant, surrendered their right to enforce the law of nature, and organized a government which was also bound by the terms of the original contract. Hindu writers vaguely suggest that somehow there was a fall from the golden age of the primeval period owing to greed getting the upper hand in human nature. How the greed, once absent from human nature, began to wrap if they couldn't explain. Just as Locke cannot explain how, in a society where the laws of reason prevailed, there were occasional breaches of its provisions, and how, when they occurred, every party in the transaction could act both as the judge and the executor. Locke makes the provisions of the original contract binding on the king. Hindu writers seek to regulate his powers by the provisions of the original divine code. It will thus be seen that the desire to put an end to anarchy and evolve better type of society and government are started to be the chief grounds for people entering into the original contract that brought government into existence. Western thinkers, however, looked at the problem from a purely secular point of view. It is well known how the views of some of them were unconsciously influenced by people's struggle against autocracy that was then in full swing in some countries. They, therefore, are anxious to thrash the idea of contract threadbare, initiate fundamental principles of political association, define the authority of the sovereign, and prescribe the conditions under which popular obedience would be accepted, and discuss whether the transfer of power by the people to the sovereign is irrevocable or otherwise. Ancient Indian writers did not live in an age of rationalism like Locke and Rousseau. They looked at the question from, switching to page number 17, a semi religious and semi sociological point of view. They have, therefore, neither gone deep into the fundamentals of the problem nor defined precisely the limits of the powers of the state and the people. They observe, for instance, that people offer obedience and taxation in return for the protection and services they expect from the government. If the king's government fails in its duty, they permit the people to remove the king and even to kill him. But what precisely will constitute a breach of the contract on the part of government? And what is the secular constitutional machinery by which people can enforce the performance of the terms of the original contract is nowhere clearly described. The permission to remove a tyrant or to kill him no doubt assumes the ultimate sovereignty of the people and invests them with supreme authority. This remedy, however, is drastic and difficult. It would have been more useful if our authorities had recommended a less extreme but more practicable remedy in the form of an everyday constitutional check. We should not, however, forget that such a remedy has been perfected even in the West only in the modern age. There are various other theories advocated about the origin of state by modern writers. It is argued that people in the distant past willingly entrusted government powers to an individual, either because he was a priest who could ensure divine help and favors, or because he was a magician who could command rain, or because he was a doctor who could cure patients. It is suggested that individuals who thus happened to gain ascendancy over the minds of their contemporaries managed to retain it by the use of force, which they could exercise with case owing to their preeminent position already recognized on a large scale. It is quite possible that in some primitive societies, government may have actually arisen owing to the operation of the above factors. But as far as the Indo European communities are concerned, the institution of the patriarchal joint families seem to have been the germ out of which state was gradually evolved. The evidence of the comparative philology shows that even when the Aryans were in their original home, they were living in joint families consisting of the grandfather, father, uncles, nephews, sons, and daughters in law. The evidence of Homer shows that these joint families were sometimes so big, switching to page number 18, as to include 2 or 300 persons. The patriarch of the joint family wielded very wide powers over its members. He could pledge, sell, amputate, and even kill any person under his potestas for an offense committed by him. The Roman patriarch possessed these powers. Some Vedic legends also show that the father could blind or sell a guilty son by virtue of his patriarchal authority. The position of the patriarch in prehistoric times was more or less like that of a king amongst all the Indo European countries. His jurisdiction increased, though perhaps his powers diminished as the joint family expanded into a big federation of several natural families springing from a common ancestor, real or imaginary, and living in the same village. The senior member of the senior most family in such a village was regarded with great reverence by the whole community and used to be entrusted with most of the governmental functions to be discharged. No doubt in consultation with other elder persons of the locality. The Rig Vedic evidence shows that the Aryan society in that early period was divided into families, Janmas, Visas, and Janas. Janmas seem to have corresponded to a village consisting of people claiming to a common descent, and a number of such villages joined together by bond of kinship seem to have constituted a Vis. Its chief was known as the Vispati. Visas were closely knit together, and on the battlefields, battalions were often arranged as per Vis, from which they were recruited. Several Visas made a Jana or tribe which had its own Janpati or the king. This organization among the Vedic Aryans shows a striking resemblance to the condition prevailing in Rome in early days. There, the smallest units, Jains, consisted of a small number of families descended from a common ancestor. A number of these gens constituted a curia, and 10 curiae made a tribe. Vedic Jana probably corresponded with the tribe, Vis with the curia, and Janman with the gen. The available evidence thus shows that, as among other Indo-Aryan communities, state was evolved in India also in, moving to page number 19, prehistoric times, out of the institution of the joint family. The patriarch of the family was instinctively revered and obeyed, and social traditions and atmosphere inspired a similar respect for and evoked a similar obedience to the head of the village and tribe, who generally acquired the status of chiefs and kings. The power of the kings gradually became more and more extensive as states became larger and larger. Now there is a change of topic. It's a subtopic types of states. So let's discuss types of state. Let us now see what were the different types of state existing in ancient India. Ancient constitutional writers hardly discuss this problem. This is probably due to their having flourished in an age when monarchy had become the prevailing type of state. Had a book on Dandaniti been written by a citizen of an aristocratic or republican state, We may have got some interesting discussion about the nature and types of different states like monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, and their relative merits and defects. But curiously enough, this does not seem to have happened. Our writers again and again revolve around the same type of state, with monarchy. Only a few of them passingly refer to Sangh, republican state. We have shown already how for a long time the state was tribal. Apart from the frequent references to Vispatis and Janpatis, the Rigveda, which was approximately 2500 BC, frequently refers to specific tribes like the Yadus, the Purus, the Anus, and the Turvasas, etc. Vishwamitra's prayers are said to have protected the Bharat people. In the Rajasuya sacrifice, the king is announced as the ruler of the Bharatas or the Kuru Panchalas and not as the sovereign of a particular district or kingdom. The notion of a Rashtra or a territorial state, however, was being gradually evolved in the later Vedic period. We find it clearly referred to in the Artha Veda. The Tritiya Samhita refers to a ritual, a partial performance of which could secure a king over lordship over his tribe but not over the country or Rashtra. The Brahmana literature frequently refers to the emperor as the ruler, not over all the tribes but over the whole earth bounded by the sea. It is clear that the nation of a territorial state was fully established at this time. Moving to page number 20, monarchy was the normal form of the state in the Vedic period. A Raja, a king, Maharaja, a great king, Samrat, an emperor. They are the different terms by which kings were designated according to their power and prestige. Some of them were also allied Savrajas or Bhojas, who precisely these terms indicated it is difficult to determine. In the description of the coronation, the ritual is sometimes described as securing Rajya, Swarajya, Bhujya, Vairajya, Maharaya, and Samrajya to one and the same individual. A doubt, therefore, naturally arises as to whether these terms really denoted different types of states or monarchies. It is, however, not unlikely that it is the desire to emphasize the omnipotence of the ritual that is responsible for the priest claiming that the king who is receiving the holy coronation from him can attain to all the different positions referred to above. This conjecture becomes more probable when we remember that a passage in the Atriya Brahma states that the different types of states like Rajya, Bhojya, Vairajya, and Samrajya flourished in different provinces of the country. In the later Indian history, we always come across a large number of kings enjoying different degrees of autonomy and ruling as feudatories of an empire, Samrat. It is not unlikely that such feudatories existed in the Vedic period as well. They may have been known as Bhojas and Swarajas and their feudal lords and Samrats. The territorial extent of the dominion of the Samrat as compared to that of a Swaraj cannot be definitely determined. Most of the states in Vedic period were small. It is doubtful whether there was a state big enough to extend over a quarter of the Punjab. The dominion of a Samrat was perhaps not much bigger than that of an ordinary king. Military glory and achievements were probably more responsible for his higher title than the extent of his dominion. States where the principal executive authority was vested in two rulers, as in ancient Sparta, were not unknown in ancient India. One such state existed at Patala in Sindh in Alexander's days, where the sovereignty was vested in two different kings hailing from different houses. The Arthashastra also refers to such a state, Probably it used to come into existence when two brothers or cousins, being claimants to, moving to page number 21, the same state preferred to rule it jointly instead of dividing it into two parts. But just as two swords cannot remain in the same scabbard, two kings can hardly rule in harmony. When the power of each is unlimited and extends over the same kingdom, such a state must have been often torn by factions and parties supporting the power of each ruler. One can, therefore, well understand why the Arthashastra does not approve of it and why a Jain monk is advised not to travel through or stay in it. To avoid discord, very often the brother or cousin rulers of a state would divide the kingdom between them, as was done in the Dwairajya kingdom created in Vidarbha by the Sungas. It would appear that though the kingdom was divided, the two rulers would hold joint consultations on all important matters. When the two kings were ruling in harmony, the state was called a two king state, Dwairaja in Prakrit and Divrajaka in Sanskrit. When they were pulling in opposite directions, it was called a self fighting state, Viruddha Rajya in Prakrit and Viruddha Rajya in Sanskrit. The Vedic literature sometimes refers to kings meeting together in the assembly. We are also told that person alone can become a king who is permitted to become one by other kings. These passages probably refer to the existence of the oligarchy where power was vested in a council of nobles, each member of which was entitled to call himself a king and had a right to elect the chief of the state, who also was called the king. We shall see later how this type of the state continued to exist down to the 6th century BC in some parts of northeastern India. Side by side with monarchical and oligarchical states, there also existed republican governments in ancient India as early as the Vedic age. A passage in the Aitharya Brahmana states that the people in the vicinity of the Himalayas, like the Uttarakurus and the Uttaramandras, have a Virat, kingless type of the state and are therefore called Virat or kingless. When it is remembered how the same passage earlier refers to, moving to page number 22, the kings of the Easterners and the Southerners and the titles that were borne by them, and how it carefully states that it is the people among the Uttarakurus and the Uttaramandras, not the kings, who were called Virat. It becomes quite certain that these people had a non monarchical or republican form of government. This conclusion is further strengthened when we remember how Greek authorities tell us that in the territory above referred to, republican types of states were the order of the day as late as the time of Alexander the Great. Whether the non monarchical states of ancient India were also it would be discussed later. Composite and confederate states were not unknown to ancient India. The Kuru Panchalas in the later Vedic period seem to have formed one composite state ruled by a common king. The Shudrakas and the Malvas were separate states in the days of Panini but are very frequently mentioned together in the Mahabharata. They had formed a confederation to meet the invasion of Alexander the Great, and it seems to have lasted for about a century. The alliance had been cemented by 10,000 intermarriages. The Republican state seems to have comprised three substates. These confederations often lasted for short periods. In the lifetime of the Buddha and Mahavira, the Lichavis had formed a confederation, once with the Malas and once with the Videhas. The Lichavi Mala Federal Council consisted of 18 members, 9 being elected by each of the confederating state. We do not, however, possess sufficient information to indicate how these composite or confederate states were functioning, what powers were retained by the federating units, and what authority was delegated to the federal center. It, however, seems very probable that the jurisdiction of the central government of the confederating states were confined only to foreign policy and the declaration and prosecution of war. Otherwise, each state retained its sovereignty. The general for the joint army in a particular campaign was elected by the confederating states. In the campaign against Alexander the Great, Shudrakas and Malwas had elected a Shudraka general Asimo who was famous for his skill and bravery. Normally, however, states in ancient India were unitary in character. King was the fountain source from which the ministers and provincial governors derived their power. Village panchayats, town councils, and great guilds also were under the general supervision and control of the central. Moving to the last page, page number 23, government. Long established tradition had, however, limited the state's intervention in the autonomy of these bodies only to those rare occasions when they were guilty of a breach of their traditional rules and constitutions. The unitary character of the state in ancient India was therefore to a great extent modified by the presence of these autonomous bodies which used to function on their own lines, though revolutions occurred at the center. So, here we end this chapter. This was from the paper Triple IPT Ideas and Institutions in Indian Political Thought, first semester. Thank you.